And welcome to another edition of the Traction Reaction Podcast. I'm Steve Zautke. With me is author Denny Miller. We've done these in the past. Whenever we get together down in Indianapolis, we like to do a podcast and talk about days of yore, so to speak. This time we're going to talk about Jimmy Clark and Team Lotus, who really upset the racing world at especially at Indianapolis in the early 60s. And Denny, what's your first memories of Colin Chapman, Team Lotus, and Jimmy Clark?
Oh, it was unbelievable. The first thing I think it really stands out was the superstition of a green-colored car. That was really taboo. And I think it went back to the days of when Gaston Chevrolet won in a green car at Indy. Then he gets killed that Thanksgiving Day at Beverly Hills, and pretty much after that, no one wanted to be a part of the green car. About the only one I could think was Jimmy Jackson in 1946.
And that was because of his high school.
High school color. That was Tech High School's colors.
Yeah.
But they really shied away from that. But Team Lotus and anything British, that was their national colors, the green color. So.
And you could trace, they weren't the first rear engine cars, but they were the first successful rear engine cars. Rear engine cars were tried in the late 30s. I forget the gentleman's name. I'll post a photo of it here. It was a real shit box, and it was just kind of thrown together. And then the Rounds was, I think it was Jack Rounds. The Rounds Rocket, I think it was called. I'll post a photo of that too. That was actually a pretty sharp-looking car. And then the Harry Miller design cars they came out, and I believe in 1938. And raced at the Speedway until I think 47, 48. One of them was involved in the death of George Bailey. They had these pontoon tanks on the side. I did an article on this on George Bailey. He was a bachelor, and I believe he was a Hudson Motor Company test driver up in Detroit. Lived with his mom and never married, and drove with a bow tie. And he's practicing in, I believe it was 1940, in this Miller rear engine car. And it was a windy day, and he came off of turn 2, hit the outside wall, split one of the pontoons, caught on fire, went onto the inside wall, heavy impact. That one blew up. Poor George was all busted up, and he's dragged himself from the burning car. He was burned up, and unfortunately passed away. I think about an hour and a half at the hospital. But those basically were kind of like backwards roadsters. It was the technology. It was just more of a center of gravity change for them. But they were kind of high cars. They weren't really. They were different, but they weren't revolutionary. So I think it was in 1960. Rodger Ward was at Watkins Glen, and he saw the Cooper car, Jack Brabham, and he actually he told me in an interview. He goes, "Yeah, I called him up and said, you guys need to come to Indianapolis for a test," because he was really interested. He was thinking, I'd like to drive this thing. So he took, it was Rodger Ward that actually kind of kicked things off and got Cooper and Brabham at the Speedway after the U.S. Grand Prix. And they came in 1960 with basically an F1 car. It was very underpowered, but faster in the corners. So the car would get beaten in the front straightaways, but would pass the roadsters in the corners. It ended up finishing 7th, but some people took note. And then Mickey Thompson, of course, the following year with Dan Gernie with that Buick.
And going back to 61.
Yeah, let's go back to 61.
It was a huge deal to have a 2-time world driving champion in Jack Brabham come. And the Speedway really wanted that. Provisions for that car that they wouldn't probably with others. It was definitely underpowered. Brabham was the first to go out to qualify because he had to fly to an F1 race in Europe. There was some confusion whether back in those days you had to raise your arm indicating starting a lap, and I don't think he knew that, or they said he did, and but they disallowed the qualification attempt. Now, time was very critical then because he had to catch the flight. So they allowed him to go back to the head of the line, and he went out and he requalified for the race at a fairly respectable speed.
Mm-hmm.
But that car was green also.
Yeah.
And so that started up. Dan Gernie and Mickey Thompson then came back in '62.
And that's when Gernie invited Colin Chapman and says, hey, you got to check this out.
And I'm not so sure that might have not been the best of the Mickey Thompson cars.
Yeah.
Had he just kept that same design, I think he would have been a lot better in '63 and certainly '64.
Yeah, those skates were an interesting concept. Yeah, but you're right. That '62 car, if you maybe could have continued to develop that, that was the first rear engine car to race at Milwaukee with Keith Porky Rackwitz, the midget driver from California. Drove it, I think, to like 11th place at Milwaukee. But yeah, that's a neat looking car. The Buick, aluminum block Buick in it. And Gernie invited Chapman, said, hey, come on. He in fact paid his way. Come on out to the Indy 500. And Chapman's looking at all these roadsters. And at that time, so 62 rear engine cars out in Europe were probably about in their third year. He's like, yeah, I think we can do this. So he put together a deal with Ford. And Ford put together, they had a couple concepts originally, and with I think a 289 it was, right, if I recall. It was interesting how they developed it. And then in '63, it was an impressive deal with Clark, and then you had Dan Gernie. So
the thing that I remember about that, besides it was green. See, Clark was not a world driving champion yet. That was in
That's
63.
right, yeah.
He wins the driving championship that year of '63, and then he comes back and wins it in '65. He was no doubt probably considered the best F1 driver.
Well, unfortunately, at that time, they were kind of going through a lot of them, weren't they?
So on pole day, Dan Gernie going into turn one crashes his car, and it was white colored.
Yeah, American colors, white with a blue stripe.
Then the next day he qualifies the backup Lotus, which was painted green. One of the first things he said was, let's paint it white. So, but as good as Gernie was, he was not as fast as Jim Clark that particular day or that particular year. Those days, Steve, obviously was still the Roadsters. And no one was going to beat Parnelli Jones in what he did in '62 when he dominated the race and the brakes faded later on and they had to finish seventh. But Parnelli dominated again in '63, but Jim Clark made it close.
So '64, of course, you had Marshman leading early, and then Clark takes over, and they had a contract with Dunlop Tires. And people think Lotus cars now, Lotus, was an F1 in that. Chapman was always kind of a little bit short on money. He ran things really, really tight. So he worked. Dunlop wanted to be a part of it. They didn't do a lot of testing at the speedway, and those tires started to chunk.
Soft tires excellent for qualifying.
But they started to chunk, didn't they?
And it broke his rear axle. I remember him coming down the main straightaway with on the wheels going up. Relatively early after Clark had dropped out. And A.J. Floyd, the Roadster, takes over and dominates the rest of the day. But I think by then in '64, you knew it was just a matter of time when the Lotus was going to win. And that sets it up perfect for 1965. And he did not.
The Lotus 38.
He did not set on the pole. He started second. He had 190 and 200 laps.
Foyt got the pole driving a what? A Lotus. So Lotus was the car. It was a love-hate relationship with the Lotus because it was a fast car. AJ wanted to go fast, but he knew at any time nothing could break. And if you're going to hit the wall, what was he going to do most likely? they catch on fire. So it was a love-hate relationship with that car. But Clark went out there and famously broke the record, and then Foyt came right after him. And remember what he said on the PA? He says, bringing the track record back to the United States, or back to America. And the crowd went crazy and whatnot. Yeah. So he was playing for the crowd.
But Floyd was not as, even though he got the pole, he was not as strong as David Martin.
No.
That day or that month.
A teammate of Bobby Johns, the stock car driver, drove the second car.
Bobby Johns did, because he brought the Woods brothers to be able to do the crewing and the tire changing.
Now this is a little, not a sore subject, but this is one of these stories that have grown over the years. The Wood brothers. And the Wood brothers came in to do the pit stops. During the 500 with Jimmy Clark, they never changed the tire. Now, if they needed to, they would have bang out, but they never did change the tire. So what you see is Clark coming in. They're doing their pit stops, fuel only, boom, on the way. But to be honest, anybody who pitted that car, Clark was going to win the race anyways. It's kind of grown out there that the Wood brothers helped, propelled them. They were the reason why
they had one pit stop that day.
Yeah, I think so, one or two or whatever. But yeah, it's one of those things that's kind of unfortunate become exaggerated. Following year in '66, it's interesting. Ford had started to pull their money away from Lotus, and like I said before, Chapman always was tight on money. So who did he bring in? STP. So you have these green Lotuses. 1963 was green. 64 was British Racing green. 65 British Racing green with the yellow. 1966 Jimmy Clark Al Unser. Dayglow STP orange. What a contrast.
And it was right at the start of the 1966 race. There was a huge pileup on the main straightaway that took almost out half the field. One person that did not take out, and started like 15, was Graham Hill.
Snuck through it.
And during that race, Jimmy Clark spun not once but twice, and still was perceived to be the winner. He took the checkered flag. Graham Hill, who they said never did pass a car in the race at all that day, was given the checkered flag. And Hill pulls into victory lane, and Clark comes down to pull in the victory lane, and they block him from coming in. So most people think Clark won the 66 race.
Some people, I think it was actually Hill to win it. And then 67.
But you know what? You know he said what STP stood for?
What's that?
Spinning takes practice at the victory banquet.
The 67 is interesting because they went up to a new car, the Lotus-Ford. It was supposed to have a BRM engine in it. It's going to be a little bit longer. The wheelbase was extended more than the Lotus 38. The BRM engine never did materialize. They went back to the 4-cam Ford, which is shorter. They could never get the car to handle. They were having all sorts of problems, weren't they?
Both Clark and Hill struggled to qualify, and then both dropped out early in the race as well.
Just an awful year. I guess it's Indianapolis, right, Denny? And sooner or later, your luck's going to catch up to you.
Well, what happened in '67 that sets the stage for '68? Andy Granatelli brings the STP Turbine, and he has Parnelli Jones drive it, and he just literally dominates the race. And just a few laps before the end, the ball bearing goes out, and he drops out before he goes on to win his third Indy. And then because it was so dominant, they pretty much effectively banned it by restricting the air intake coming in.
But not enough.
Not enough, because Colin Chapman then
the Lotus 56, one of my favorite cars of all time,
builds this wedge-shaped, much lighter thing to put the turbines in. And his 3 drivers were going to be Jimmy Clark, Jackie Stewart, and Graham Hill. And then on April 7th, Jimmy Clark gets killed at Hockenheim, Germany, in the F2 race. Jackie Stewart breaks his wrist somewhere along that line and is not able to drive. So they hire Mike Spence, a Formula One driver, to drive Clark's car. And immediately at Indy, he was the fastest and flirting with the track record. And a month to the day on May 7th, he goes into turn 1, kind of bumps the wall, the wheel comes off, hits him in the head. And Mike Spence was killed a month to the day.
Now, Spence was driving the 60 car. However, he was testing the number 30 car, which Greg Weld was driving.
And struggling a bit.
And Greg Weld told a story that I never heard before, about 10, 15 years ago, is that he's driving the 30 car, he gets pulled out. They want to put Spence in it, which is common, just to get a feel for the car, what's wrong with the car. So Spence gets in, both have white helmets. Greg Weld's wife is in the stands, sees the car going out thinking it's Greg, sees the car hit the wall, knows it's serious. She's like, oh my God. She's like losing her mind, thinking her husband is seriously hurt, much less killed. And she goes into the infield. Boom. Greg looks her up and says, no, I'm here, I'm fine. And, was relieved. Sadly, though, Mike Spence was killed in that crash. And he was a BRM driver. He was on loan to Lotus. And it's interesting, you'd never see that today. That would never happen. But that's what happened back then. Sadly, Mike Spence, who was on the verge of greatness, was killed. So then
I think Spence would have been on the pole.
So it ended up, it's such an incredible driver shuffle that they ended up then on race day with Joe Leonard, who got the pole, Graham Hill qualified second, and then Art Pollard, who
picked on that Saturday afternoon to get in the car.
After other drivers had driven that car, including Leroy Yarborough, tested that car.
And Clark, Graham Hill never was that particularly fast a qualifier at Indy. He had to qualify second in that, and they thought, well, he could very well win Indy for a second time. Crashes mid-race. But Leonard almost wins, like Parnelli the year before in the Turbine in the late stages of the race. He drops out, and then Bobby Unser winds up winning his first race. So,
and those cars drove most of the rest of the schedule. And talking to, I think it might have been Joe Leonard, the problem with that car was the brakes. With a piston engine car, you're driving down the front straightaway, whether it's Indy or a road course, let's say with long straightaways, you let off at the gas, the engine helps slow you down. Turbine didn't. Turbine would just turn off. So there's none of that engine helping the rev limiter, whatever almost like a Jake brake to help slow you down. So, and the brakes in 1968, the technology was not there. So they would just burn up the brakes, whether they were running at Moseport, Riverside. I think Riverside, they were running the 2 cars, and they both crashed. Just one went off the road. Mario, in fact, was the last driver to drive it when he got in the car. He was racing for a national championship. At that point, you'd get points for whatever laps you drove. They changed the rules now, but back then they were just getting in the cars to get as much points as they could. Mario and Bobby Unser. So.
And then they changed the rules again, which basically was the final nail.
They had a couple turbines tried it. Jack Adams had a turbine, a real long pencil-like design, and then Jigger Soroy ran a turbine at Indy in '70, I think it was, and a Gerhardt chassis. Drove that car in Milwaukee too, but it was not competitive. But sadly, my opinion, I would like to have seen turbines continue. Maybe they didn't have to kill them as much as they did. Maybe have a couple turbines, but I can understand it. They didn't want 33 turbines out there.
Do you think had the turbines made as much noise as a conventional race engine, there wouldn't have been that animosity toward it?
It's interesting because hydroplane racing went that route. Hydroplane racing, you had those Merlin engines and the Rolls-Royce Merlins, in those cars, and that magical sound of those hydroplanes in the 60s and 70s. And, we had hydroplanes in Milwaukee in 1990, and there's one boat still had a piston engine in it, and that was Miss Madison. And I basically went down to the lakefront just to hear that car, or hear that boat, I should say. And then the turbines totally took over, and unfortunately, hydroplane racing has kind of disappeared. So maybe that's one of the things that USAC got right.
Yeah, they had to kind of, that's all you heard. And everything.
Yeah.
So that basically was the end of Lotus in the Indy 500.
If you're interested in the turbine, there's one that runs in the vintage Indy series and runs around, and that's Bruce Lensmeyer and his beautiful Lotus 56. We'll look it up on the Traction Reaction podcast in the videos. I did it about 2 years ago, and Bruce walks me through how he came about with the car, restored it, and Bruce is Mr. Turbine. That's his full-time job. Is he works on helicopter turbines and rebuilds them down in Florida. Neat guy, good friend, and appreciate what he does.
And for those who really don't know what Colin Chapman looked like, he bore a resemblance to actor David Evans.
Yes, he did.
And just a very welcome addition to what makes Indy.
And of course, later helped Mario Andretti win his World Championship in 1978. Denny, appreciate it. It's Indianapolis. We're in Indianapolis at Charlie Brown's race weekend, and always a special seeing you coming in from California, me from Wisconsin. We meet in Indianapolis and just enjoy everything about it. So we appreciate you listening and subscribing and liking the Traction Reaction podcast, and looking forward to do it again soon.
Like swallows and Capistrano.
There you go. Thank you.